All right, so welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be back.
Today we're going way
Too
back,
bad.
like 100,000 years back,
Wow.
to explore these fascinating discoveries
Yeah.
coming out of Tinshemet Cave in Israel.
Really cool stuff.
We've been poring over these archaeological reports,
Right.
especially those findings published in Nature.
Human behavior.
Great publication. Really trying to bring you, the listener, a clearer understanding
Certainly.
of what was such a pivotal period in human history.
It is pivotal.
And I think it's fascinating because when we talk about Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, our ancient cousins,
Right.
we often think of them as these totally separate groups.
Yeah, kind of living in isolation.
But what we're seeing from Tinshemet, it really challenges that view.
Oh, absolutely. It's way more complex, way more interesting.
Exactly right. Way more intricate.
Yeah.
And so for our listeners out there who, really want to delve into this ancient connection without getting, too bogged down by academic jargon.
Right. Who wants to read all those long papers?
Exactly.
Right.
This deep dive is really your shortcut.
Your express lane.
Exactly. And our mission today.
Lay on me.
Our mission today is really simple. To understand the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Okay.
Based on what we're finding in Tinshemet Cave.
Great.
So were they rivals, kind of coexisting but at a distance? Or were they something more, maybe even neighbors who shared a lot more than we ever imagined?
Right. Yeah. All really interesting questions.
So let's get into it. Maybe you can set the scene for us a little bit.
Yeah. So Tinshemet Cave, it's located in central Israel, a region known as the Levant.
Okay.
And these archaeological layers, they date to what we call the Middle Paleolithic period, which spans from about 300,000 to 30,000 years ago.
Wow, that's a long time.
A vast timescale, right?
Yeah.
But we're going to zoom in on a specific window within that, about 130,000 to 80,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And based on radiometric dating, we see a real concentration of findings right around the 100,000 year mark.
So it's like a really focused window into this period.
Exactly. A key moment.
And what makes this site so crucial, I think, for our understanding
Yeah.
is that it provides us with a truly unprecedented view into a time when both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens
Right.
were present in this same region, in this Levantine corridor.
Sharing the space.
Right. And this challenges the older idea that these groups lived in complete isolation from one another.
Yeah, the narrative is changing.
Reversing.
It's becoming much more nuanced.
And the central finding from Tinshemet is the evidence of their coexistence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, not just that they were in the same general area at different times, but that they were there together, interacting, potentially sharing aspects of their lives.
That's amazing. And one of the most striking pieces of evidence of this proximity
Yeah.
is the discovery of several human burials belonging to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens within the cave.
Right. We're not talking about just fragments of bone here.
Yeah, right.
These look like formal, intentional burials, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, wow. And that brings us to this idea of cultural exchange, right?
Exactly. That's where the story really gets interesting.
So let's delve into that. Let's start with something very fundamental to their survival, and that's how they made their stone tools, what's called lithic technology.
Okay, great.
So what are we finding there?
Well, at Tinshemet Cave, the dominant way they produce these stone tools is something called the centripetal leveloir technique.
Centripetal leveloir. That sounds complicated.
Sure, a mouthful, right.
Yeah.
But think of it this way. It's a very sophisticated method for preparing a core of stone so you can strike off flakes of a predictable size and shape.
Oh, okay.
Almost like, a potter carefully shaping clay before creating a specific pot.
I see. So it's a skilled technique.
Exactly. And it wasn't unique to Tinshemet. This technique was also used at other key regional sites from the same period, like Kafsa, Shkul, and Nisharamla.
Oh, interesting. So this suggests a shared approach, almost like a common technological language across these different locations.
Exactly, yeah. A shared knowledge base.
And what does this specific technique, the centripetal leveloir, tell us about their capabilities and their planning?
Well, it indicates a high degree of both planning and skill. At Tinshemet, they've found these cores, the original pieces of flint that were shaped, as well as the various bits chipped off in the process. They've got deboardon flakes, leveloir points, all sorts of things.
So it's not just the finished product, they're finding evidence of the entire process.
Exactly. The whole napping sequence.
And they were using local materials, right?
Yeah, primarily a type of flint called Michiash Formation Campanian flint.
Okay.
And the sheer quantity of these remnants suggests they were doing a lot of tool production right there in the cave.
So they weren't just picking up whatever they could find.
No, they were actively shaping and creating their tools on site.
And you mentioned different types of flakes, like these Levallois points. What information do those provide?
Well, the presence of these different flake types, including some that are called pseudo-Levallois flakes.
Pseudo.
Yeah, they look kind of similar, but have slightly different characteristics.
Got it.
And along with those prepared cores, it really shows this consistent, deliberate use of the centripetal Levallois technique.
Okay.
Now, interestingly, they found a relatively small number of tools that had been further modified or retouched. The most common type of retouched tool was a simple side scraper, which is a tool with a sharpened edge, and these were a bit more common in one specific area of the cave, the first chamber.
So side scrapers, would those have been used for tasks like working with hides or shaping wood?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Really practical, everyday tools.
Essential for survival.
Absolutely.
And researchers did this really cool thing where they looked at these tools under a microscope.
Oh, yeah. Use wear analysis.
Yes, exactly.
Fascinating stuff.
To look for signs of wear and tear.
Right. To see how they were used.
And what did that reveal?
Well, it showed a range of activities. Whittling wood, scraping hides, cutting or sawing bone and wood, even butchering animals.
So a pretty versatile toolkit, it sounds like.
Absolutely. A real multi-tool.
And here's where it gets really thought-provoking. This lithic technology seems consistent across different early Homo groups in the Levant during this mid-middle Paleolithic period.
Right. That's a crucial point.
So Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and even these other archaic human groups in the region were all using basically the same methods to make their tools.
Yeah, suggesting a significant level of connection and sharing of knowledge.
Yeah.
What we call cultural diffusion.
So they were operating from a similar playbook.
Exactly.
And this uniformity in the Levant during this period, it really contrasts with both earlier and later periods in the region.
Yeah, and also with what was going on at the same time in East Africa, which showed much more diversity in tour making.
So it's like this snapshot in time where in the Levant, these different human groups were surprisingly aligned in their technology.
It really is.
It's fascinating. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another vital aspect of their lives, how they survived. And that's their hunting strategies, as evidenced by the animal remains found in the cave.
Right.
What are we finding there?
So the animal bones they found at Tinshemet are primarily those of ungulates, hooved mammals like deer and gazelle.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that there are several different types of large prey animals represented in pretty similar numbers. They've got aurochs, which are extinct wild cattle.
Wow.
Different kinds of ancient horses, equids,
Okay.
Mesopotamian fallow deer, and mountain gazelle.
So a varied diet of large game.
Yeah, seems so.
Does this tell us anything about their hunting skills or perhaps the environment they were living in?
Well, it suggests they were capable of successfully hunting a range of large and potentially dangerous prey.
Right.
Which takes skill and coordination. And compared to earlier and later periods in the Levant, this mid-middle Paleolithic seems to show a greater reliance on these larger-bodied ungulates.
So more coordinated hunting efforts, perhaps, or maybe changes in the environment that made these bigger animals more abundant.
It could be a mix of both, yeah.
Makes sense.
Now, another interesting point is that the numbers of remains for these different animals aren't uniform throughout the cave.
Oh, really?
There are variations between different areas like the terrace, the first chamber, and what they call the dark brown layer.
So different parts of the cave might have been used in different ways.
Exactly. Or maybe it reflects changes in the availability of these animals in the surrounding environment over time.
It's amazing how these subtle differences within the cave can tell us so much.
It is, yeah. The cave becomes a kind of time capsule.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to something that gives us a glimpse into their more symbolic world.
Okay.
And that's ochre. Over 7,500 fragments of this mineral pigment were found at Tinshemet.
That's a huge amount.
It is, right? That's a lot of ochre. So what does this tell us?
Well, most of this ochre is in the red to orange range, and some of it appears to have been intentionally heated, probably to alter its color, maybe make it more intense.
So they're manipulating it, not just using it as they find it.
Exactly. There's intentionality here.
And where was this ochre found in relation to other things in the cave?
That's where it gets really interesting. They found high concentrations of ochre in the same layers as the human burials, often very close to the remains themselves.
Oh, wow.
For instance, there's a large chunk of ochre found right between the legs of one individual.
So this suggests a deliberate connection between ochre and burial practices.
Yeah. strongly suggesting a symbolic use maybe for body decoration or rituals associated with death.
Right, so maybe ochre was used to mark status within the group or for some kind of symbolic adornment.
That's a very plausible interpretation.
Yeah.
And they identified 6 different classes of ochre. Yeah, and analysis shows that these materials likely came from different sources, some potentially quite far away, like the Galilee in the north and the central Negev in the south.
So they're going to great lengths to acquire this ochre.
It seems so, yeah.
Hmm.
This effort to get specific ochre from distant locations tells us it was important to them.
It wasn't just any red dirt, it was special.
Exactly. And this also hints at possible exchange networks, maybe even early forms of trade.
Right, fascinating. And you mentioned earlier that similar uses of ochre have been found at other sites like Kafsa and Shkul.
Right, which reinforces the idea that this was a shared symbolic practice across different Homo groups in the Levant during this period.
It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as ochre can provide such profound insights into their symbolic world.
It really is. It opens up a whole new dimension to understanding their lives.
Now let's turn to what is perhaps the most compelling evidence of shared culture.
Okay?
And that's their social structures, as revealed through their burial customs.
Right.
So what can you tell us about these burials?
Well, the discoveries at Tinshemet include the formal burial of both adults and children. We're talking about nearly complete, articulated skeletons, not just scattered bones.
So they're carefully placed, not just abandoned.
Yeah, these are clearly intentional burial practices.
And what about the positions of the bodies?
Well, most of the bodies were found in what's called a flexed position, often described as fetal or sleeping. They're on their sides with their legs drawn up towards their chest, their arms bent, and their head often facing downwards.
That's a very specific posture.
It is, and what's remarkable is that this same posture is found in burials at Kafsta and School caves.
So even though these are different sites and potentially different groups of early humans,
Right.
we see this shared way of treating the dead.
It's a powerful connection. And the majority of these burials appear to be primary burials, meaning the skeletons were found in their original anatomically correct positions.
So they were buried relatively soon after death.
It seems so, yeah.
And then there's the ochre again, right?
Yeah, exactly. Those large pieces of ochre we talked about earlier were often found alongside the remains.
So it's not just a random coincidence. The ochre was intentionally placed there with the deceased.
It really underscores that symbolic connection we were discussing.
It suggests shared beliefs or rituals related to death and perhaps even the afterlife.
Exactly, yeah. These shared burial customs at Tinshemet really point to shared beliefs about death and what may come after.
And this is a really important point for our listeners. These mid-middle Paleolithic burials in the Levant are the earliest, well-documented examples of intentional Homo burials that we know of.
They really are. They predate similar practices in Europe and Africa by tens of thousands of years.
That's incredible. So the Levant was a real hub for this early ritualistic behavior.
It seems so, yeah. A place where innovation and cultural exchange were flourishing.
So we've talked about shared technology, hunting practices, symbolic ochre use, and even these really complex burial customs. What does all of this tell us about the broader context and the implications for how we understand human evolution?
Well, it paints a picture of the Levant during the mid-middle Pleistocene as this really dynamic melting pot, a place where different early human groups encountered and interacted with each other.
Like a crossroads of different populations.
Exactly, yeah. And this was likely facilitated by favorable climatic conditions at the time, which would have led to population expansions and more movement of people.
So it's not just a static picture of separate groups.
Not at all. It's dynamic and fluid.
And the fossil record shows us that there were several different hominin groups present in this Levantine mid-MP. We've got archaic Neanderthal, like Neanderthals themselves, and then Homo sapiens.
Yeah, a real mix.
So the big question is, how did these different groups interact? Did they keep their behaviors and cultures separate, or did these encounters lead to a mixing and sharing of cultural practices?
That's the million-dollar question. Were they living parallel lives, or were their cultures intermingling?
And what does the evidence suggest?
Well, when we look at Tinshemet, along with findings from other sites in the region like Nesher Ramla, Kafse, and Shkul, it really points towards a merging of behaviors in the Levantine mid-MP.
So, despite their potential physical differences, they seem to have been operating within a similar cultural framework.
That's what it looks like. We see the same lithic technology, the focus on hunting large game, the intentional burials with ochre.
So a lot of similarities.
Yeah, a lot of overlap.
And what do the researchers think is driving this behavioral uniformity?
They believe it's likely due to increased interactions between these different groups.
So more contact equals more sharing of ideas and practices.
Exactly. And they even suggest there might have been interbreeding or admixture between these groups.
So they weren't just sharing culture, they might have been sharing genes as well.
Right. It's a much more interconnected picture than we used to think.
And this actually ties back to some of the physical characteristics observed in fossils from this region, right?
Yeah, the facial and dental morphology of some fossils from Kafjian school, for example, has led some scientists to believe they might represent hybrid populations with genetic input from different groups.
So the cultural sharing might have been mirrored in their biology as well.
It's a fascinating possibility.
It really challenges the older idea of these separate, isolated lineages.
Yeah, the old tree model of human evolution is becoming much more of a braided stream.
I like that analogy. So to summarize for our listeners, what are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Tinshemet Cave?
Okay, well, the discoveries at Tinshemet provide really compelling evidence for cultural exchange and a shared way of life between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in the Levant around 100,000 years ago. We've got shared tool technologies, hunting strategies, symbolic ochre use, and remarkably similar burial customs, including those flex burials and the ochre as grave goods.
And for our listeners out there, why should they care about this? Why is this deep dive into a cave from 100,000 years ago relevant today?
Well, I think it gives us this incredible glimpse into a past that was far more complex and dynamic than we used to imagine. These different early human groups weren't just existing alongside each other. They were interacting, sharing knowledge, maybe even interbreeding, and shaping each other's cultures and potentially their biology. It really highlights the Levant as this crucial region for understanding human evolution and the intricate relationships between these different early human species. The story of our origins is not a simple, straightforward narrative. It's a tapestry woven from many threads.
Absolutely. It compels us to think differently about our own past.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder, if these groups were interacting so closely, what was the nature of their communication? What were their social bonds like?
Yeah, what were those everyday encounters like?
Right. And could these interactions, the sharing of knowledge and perhaps even genes, have contributed to the eventual success and spread of Homo sapiens?
It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it?
It really is. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you, the listener, to continue exploring the fascinating field of paleoanthropology and the ongoing research into our shared human origins. There's so much more to discover, so much more to learn.
Absolutely. The story's still being written.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.